Welcome to another Smart QA Musings, which is a gentle flurry of interesting thoughts. Today's topic is centered around immersion. And we're talking more from the practice of what we do, and then we'll probably connect it on, when we go to the end, to AI piece as to what it does to our immersion. So it's titled Soaking Before Sensing, and therefore immersion enables probing. So let's start with a simple question. And the question here is, when we test, most often there is a certain notion of a scripted thing that we do have. We start with a plan, we have some test cases, some stuff we do, but we probably find things, interesting things, not necessarily by planned piece, but by things outside of what we plan. So the question really is, why do some of the sharpest insights appear before we even do the job? What happens? Why do we have a kind of a faint discomfort or a subtle intuition, a sense of something is off sometimes before we commence? So that it's not always just about following a script and doing some things and therefore finding maybe issues or making observations. That's because I think there are two parts that we do, and sometimes I think when I ask this question to some people in a different form, they say, hey, ad hoc is more powerful. That's what they kind of seem to say. But truly it's not ad hoc the way we understand, which is random. Probably creative is what you might choose to do. But what really is happening is we are actually deep, and some of the depth shows. So if you were to picturize it, think of it as that if there is internal stuff, which is more of a skeleton, which kind of represents a logic, which represents the logical way we think, whereas the quote unquote the flesh, so to speak, that surrounds is more like the act of immersion. So you see, we might be very organized, we might be very logical, maybe using frameworks, maybe using methods, processes, automation, etc. And therefore our logical mind, in a way, gives us the skeletons. It gives us the structure, the clarity, the order. But there is a fundamental sensitive part that is quite a more insight, maybe harder to name. And that becomes, in a way, essential for intelligent probing. And that is why I think sometimes the answer to the question, though seemingly simple as ad hoc, is possibly the result of intelligent probing, which we observe as flows and transitions and intentions and possible tensions. And that's really the flesh. In a way, like they reveal themselves at different depths of attention. But this entire notion of assurance, this business of intelligent probing, which is really because of some immersiveness, being connected, which are behaviors beneath the behavior, is like a texture. They appear only when we kind of linger long enough. They seem to sense what hides beneath the lines. And therefore, in a way, immersion is kind of seeing the art of seeing the full body, not just the bones, right? And that's what it is. So I'm just trying to establish the context in terms of saying, hey, we can't just forget the notion of immersion and flow and not just think of it in terms of pure logic and the ability to do, human or otherwise. And therefore, when we look at the act of soaking, what does soaking mean? It means before we probably even touch, before we even get deep into the system, we in a way let the system touch us. What do you mean by that? It's like we study the lineage. What are the choices? Why do they want it? Why this kind of design? So we're kind of looking at, in some sense, the lineage, the past, the history, the bigger context of why some things are being done. And second, we don't just immediately before we touch the system, we understand the relationship, the various pieces that make up the system, the components, the integration points, and so on and so forth. We kind of, in some sense, try to absorb some of the tensions the system would go through. Where does it strain? Where could it load? What are choke points? What are complexities? And so on. And finally, we, in some sense, linger on some of these ambiguities which we still don't understand. Because we're trying to ask questions. We just ask questions rather than rush to an answer. Right? And it is not just about a casual reading of requirements. It's really about saturating yourself in the problem space. It is about absorbing. It's about letting, in a way, the system's story get deep in us. When that happens, then it's an investment. And that's why we let the system touch us, just like the roots underground which expand. We don't know what it is, right? We can't see the roots which is brilliantly expanding underneath the ground. And that's what soaking is all about, right? So the soaking becomes a fairly important element in the act of understanding and therefore promoting the idea of an intelligent probing. So when we actually start the activity of what we do, which probably is a bit of sensing, and so sensing is nothing but the actual probing. And maybe it is much sharper simply because you have soaked well, right? It's probably the testing, the exploring, the probing, the discovering, and that's what sensing is all about. And it's intelligent just because you soaked well, and therefore your probes probably land where they matter. Questions seem to emerge naturally. Maybe observations, sharpen without much effort, seemingly much effort, and that is really sensing. And that is simply because of the fact that soaking makes it intelligent rather than mechanical, right? And sensing is not just the beginning, it's a continuation of the activity, right? We start off by soaking and then we start sensing, and you don't say, it's not the beginning, right? It continues on. And therefore, what the interesting thing about the soaking and sensing is, it is slow. Soaking is slow. And therefore, because we are trying to soak, we are trying to absorb, it's a bit of a slow work, which ultimately helps us in rapid sensing, and that is fast intuition. And the slow absorption phase, what it possibly helps us is to build up the mental structures that later make up the intuition possible. I'm sure you might have seen some very interesting books on these. There is The Flow by Michelle Mihaly, long name, I'll tell you the name Mihaly, and easier to pronounce the first name, The Flow, that's the name of the book. There's another lovely book by Daniel Kahneman, whose book title is Thinking Fast and Slow. And Daniel Kahneman really talks about two systems of thinking in our minds. The system 2 thinking, which is slow, deliberate, analytical, effortful, and the system 1, which is fast, automatic, intuitive. So soaking is system 2 work, and the sensing is really helping you build patterns for system 1. So when you kind of soak deeply, studying the lineage, tracing the flows, building the mental models, you're really doing slow, effortful work, right? Which is hard. And that's why it's slow work. But this deliberate absorption moves the patterns into system 1, which allows us to train and therefore recognize them pretty quickly, right? And that's when it becomes fast intuition. And that's what he calls as the expert reaction, an expert tester. And that's why you kind of sometimes sense, where we start off with a question, something feels off. You're able to sense it, and then you probe a little more deeper to possibly find out what is really wrong, and then of course, to find out what could be done to avert it, what are reasons, and so on and so forth. So Daniel Kahneman's work, which is outlined in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, kind of talks about the system 2, system 1 kind of a thinking. Now, one of the earlier books than that, which probably is at least 2 decades old, which I read many years ago, which is called Flow, which is from the author who is a Czechoslovakian, Hungarian, first name is easily pronounceable because it's Mihaly. The second name is a pretty complicated pronunciation for me, at least. It's Csikszentmihalyi. Okay, and he actually discovered that peak performance is really because of flow state, when you're totally immersed. Of course, you must have also skill, to meet the entire stuff. And basically, without that soaking, complexity overwhelms the understanding, which I think in an earlier musings, I said complexity is really an intellectual problem. It's not a systemic problem. So if I am not able to comprehend the complexity of the system, because system is seemingly complex, because I am not able to grasp it, then the system seems complex. And that obviously creates anxiety and so on and so forth. But what we're trying to do with soaking is try to elevate the understanding to meet the intellectual, to kind of pare the problem down, and therefore say, it's not that complex, right? And that's what Mihaly talked about in his book on flow, where he really talked about the idea of immersion and flow as necessary to peak performance, which we understand very much when we see sportsmen, because in a few hours you know how well they are able to perform, right? And if that day is off, it's a hard day for them. So slow work trains fast intuition. So, having established that probably soaking and sensing are fundamental to what we do, to intelligent probing, to smarter assurance, what does it take to immerse? That is to soak and sense well. Maybe there are 5 of these things that one can keep in mind, which are really not exactly a technique. They are more like conditions to enable. So I'm going to title this as 5 invitations. That is, ways of arranging oneself to enable deep soaking. Because once you soak well, automatically you start sensing well, right? And therefore you're able to respond. Which we will probably spend a few minutes on each one of them. But what are they really? And this is not a technique, right? It's a practice. And what you're trying to do is, here is what it is. Maybe something to do with time, temporal, something to do with the relationship to outside, relational, something to do with the larger environment, something which is preparatory in nature, and something which is very sensory in nature. So let's dig a little deeper to kind of use on each one of them. And what these primarily do is these invitations, if practiced well, maybe in some sense create the right soil for the immersion to grow. To take the metaphor from that, the rooted tree that we saw a few minutes ago. So what do you mean by temporal? It simply says, look, we need to get into depth. And that depth requires a certain uninterrupted time. Because attention is not instantaneous, it gathers slowly. And therefore, another interesting book on deep work by Cal Newport, which I think is probably 5-6 years old, or maybe 10 years old, whose research was on attention. And what he said in this book primarily is your brain doesn't switch very clearly in between tasks, which we know we do a lot today. We context switch. I'm sure in all our digital systems, we probably have many windows open, many things open at the same time, and each of them is demanding attention, a mail, social stuff, an alarm, a meeting, and so on and so forth, Slack, and so on. So what Cal Newport says is, look, deep work demands that you focus. So you just need to give it time, and you can't switch. So you can't switch contextually. This is multitasking, as we call today, is now frowned upon in some sense. It requires a cleared attention. And that's what Mihaly in his flow also talked about, where it says flow requires a continuous amount of time. It takes about 15-20 minutes to enter the flow state. And then the fragmentation. If any fragmentation is there, that means something else comes up in the way. If a mail has to be replied, somebody gives you a call, you looked at social media, whatever, then you don't get into that flow state. It fragments it. So The invitation of the temporality simply means that depth requires uninterrupted time, and that's why it's perceived slow, which I think is in a way frowned upon given the fact you can't use the word slow today, right? So you want to go deep. Part 2, the invitation number 2, is really about the sensory piece. Maybe we are observing, right? And we're trying to construct a mental model. But the understanding deepens when other parts of the body participate. Like what? I do that quite a bit of time, maybe sometimes reading it aloud or sketching or taking notes. Or sometimes you just get up and walk or, look outside, do something else. It's not wandering, it is basically you're engaging the other sensorial aspects and they seemingly connect, right? So Cal Newport in his book talks about this as productive meditation, walking while focusing on a single problem. Or sometimes you read something and in the process you connect better. It's like a kinesthetic memory, right? So the idea here is soaking, in addition to the temporality where it says, look, uninterrupted time, maybe also says extend it. If you're doing one piece, extend other senses, maybe doodling and writing and stuff like that, or, reading aloud, or, physically walking around and thinking about something, and so on and so forth, walk the scenario, so to speak, right? So, engage the other senses. Number 3, the invitation number 3 is really about being more relational. What do you mean by relational? Rather than just saying, does it do X and getting asking an answer and finding a very pointed answer. You're more like constructing a hypothesis. You're trying to put out some curious kind of a question. What if? How might it? As if I am talking to the system. And that's why it's titled as treating the system as a conversational partner. Though the system in this case might be the system under test, and therefore it's certainly not living. But once I start treating it as a partner, then I'm not interrogating it. I'm having more curiosity in the entire process, and therefore enabling some of the inner logic to do this. Right? And it's a shift, therefore, from plain vanilla interrogation to something more of curiosity. Right? So, in a way, what you're doing here is you are losing yourself of not just you as a disembodied person alone, but now you are in a space where you're cohabiting with the system, right? You just stop you seeing yourself, the boundary, but you and the activity in a way dissolves. You're starting to seek, soak more deeply, and therefore you're in a way you're conversing with the system. Now, other than professional work where I do attempt to practice some of these things that we're talking about, which is why I'm sharing your musings, I see that every time when you do any long distance activity as an endurance event, cycling or running, which are very long events for me. Sometimes it could be the shortest ones is like 12 hours, the longest ones could be like a few days. So very recently, of course, there was a 600-kilometer cycle ride, which took about 40 hours. So, and it's a kind of a non-stop ride. So quite obviously, other than the physical aspect of it, it's more often a mental challenge. How do you not give up? Interestingly, the last 120 odd kilometers back to Bangalore from this place called Ranebennur, which is where we went and came back, in the last 100 odd kilometers is a pretty pathetic road because we come on the Tumkur road, right? And therefore, there is a lot of traffic and a lot of road works are happening. But the interesting thing is, what I notice when I get into that constrained situation, where there is a massive amount of traffic very close to you, and of course the road surface is challenging because a lot of road works. It's interesting that you get into a kind of I get into a kind of a flow, and then the last nearly about a couple of hours or 3 hours or 4 hours happens to, you don't even know the passage of time, and you have blurred between you, the cyclist, the cycle, and the environment. So you are kind of cohabiting, and that is what makes this entire thing possible. I don't think it's a matter of strength, right? So some of these ideas of temporality and being part of that, and constantly adjusting by treating it as an entire thing as one, is something that I experience quite a bit. And the fourth invitation, the fourth dimension to this is about the clarity in terms of the environment. If it's less cluttered, if it's much helps you focus, could be like not too many tabs on the computer, or an environment which is possibly conducive. Not some people okay with perfect silence, some people okay with little bit of noise, but basically, how do I create a space for depth? Physical clutter, digital clutter, sometimes produce shallow work. So you need to shut off. So there is the invitation from an environment. If the environment I could adjust, then it will help me to soak better. These are more like simple rituals that we follow, right? And the final one is more in terms of the preparation, the early stage preparation, which is about saying, look, the ability to concentrate, the ability to not answer the phone, right? And deal with uncertainty. And which means we are not trying to say, oh, everything is clean. So sometimes when things are ambiguous, things are not clear, it is a little messy, it sharpens our sensitivity. And if we can give it its full attention, then maybe it is far more superior for us to go into the depth. So very clearly outlining what I don't know, and therefore digging in further. It is about possibly embracing even a certain amount of boredom, because this is not going to be fun, right? And that I discover every time in cycling. That is, suddenly it hits you that, oh my gosh, I've got to go through these bad roads for a long enough time. Or it's still a long ways away before I even reach my destination. And rather than getting frustrated about it, sometimes you convert that entire thing into something that's deeply connected, and then that entire event becomes interesting, right? So the lingering in the ambiguity that makes us uncomfortable is necessary. And that immersion, it helps us, it makes it possible for us to, that happens, so to speak, because of this uncomfortableness, right? So it is to immerse really is to sit with it, what is unresolved, naming what you don't know, noticing what you hope isn't true. So they're all uncomfortable pieces. It's more like an uncertainty, right? So these 5 elements possibly have a significant bearing in how we are able to soak well, and therefore have a far more depth before we engage in the primary activity. And of course, while in that activity, we obviously are soaking, we are sensing better, and this iterates quite a bit, right? Now, if I flip over, if all these were human practices, and today in this world we have tools and AI tools, how does this affect? That's the last bit that I want to talk about. So how does AI affect immersion? How does it help us in soaking, or does not allow us to soak? And how does the same thing happen with respect to sensing? The AI systems today seem to have a lot of promise, right? They seem to make things far more easier. They give you quick answers. You don't need to read a 100-page document. It probably summarizes very quickly, right? Tools give you all the answers. They rush to give you answers. And in the process of getting the easy answers, the AI speaks too quickly. and therefore maybe shuts off my curiosity subtly. I'm going to be mindful of that part, right? So instant summaries, lots of rapid test generation, putting out a plan, strategy, test cases or assets or whatever. All these are instant stuff. It's too quick. If quite obviously it does not foster slow, right? And always on assistant. So whenever I need some help, I click on it and gives me the answer. So I'm being dulled into the entire stuff. So that's the anti part of the AI. It doesn't help. But if there anything that we do in the context of AI, which is more of an illumination, it only gently lights up that area, then maybe it helps me to soak better, right? It amplifies my sensing. So the question is not, question is about, be mindful of the fact there are certain facets of AI which are going to be anti-immersive and certain of those that are pro-immersive. So any systems that promise, all you have to do is just give me a prompt and lo and behold, I'll give you everything. Watch it, right? Because if that is an intellectual piece of work and if it gives you the answer, you're going to instantly take it and that's the end of story. But if that's a standard plain activity which does not require any intellectual capacity, then that answer is okay because you can just outsource this piece of work and get it done, right? So anything which is instant summaries, rapid generation, always on assistance, be wary. But if something is there, it is able to construct a hypothesis, it's helping you figure out a few things, establish connections, put together a mapping, then maybe that's useful, right? So that's one way to look at it. If the AI now co-works with you as a companion, as an assistant, which is what I think we did talk about in the earlier ones, it listens, then it's certainly very illuminating. It's like we have one spotlight, the AI has another spotlight, and we are able to shine better. It helps us maybe in revealing certain patterns. Maybe it's not just replacing perception. It is maybe highlighting certain problem areas and tensions. It's not telling you that this is wrong. It's not imposing a conclusion, right? And therefore the best AI, so to speak, does not decide what matters. It helps us see. It acts as a spotlight, acts as a nice lantern. So if I were to go if I were to go one step further before we conclude and look at, okay, maybe there are a lot of tools that are being built today. How could we look at some of the features and understand what could be pro and what could be anti? These are some samples of ideas that could be deemed as pro-immersive features of a tool, right? So when you say pro-immersive, it means helps me in the act of soaking and sensing. For example, what do you mean by saying working acid? Maybe there's a tool which works in the background. When I'm sleeping, it maybe looks at the code, maybe looks at certain defects that are being filed, whatever, right? But it works asynchronously. It prepares a context while I'm sleeping. So it helps me to analyze some of those stuff, synthesize some interesting ideas, so that when I come, then maybe say, hey, I found something interesting. That's the first one. So if there are any features like that which kind of trawl and go ahead and and do some help, prep work for me, certainly it's a good feature to have. The second kind of feature is when I am in the mode, if I am in a kind of a session mode where I am deeply inside the system, so to speak, understanding, analyzing, experimenting, whatever. If it stays silent, it's fantastic. If it even sort of irritating me with, hey, I can tell you this, or it pops up something, right? So if it's silent, then it probably is conducive to what I do. The third, if let's say features which amplifies after sensing. So I sense something, it kind of amplifies it. Maybe it says, hey, this is great, but maybe these are possible too. And it maybe gives you suggestions or stuff like that, right? And therefore it helps you to discover more patterns, right? This one, the dialogue partner, is more like when I ask, it answers. It's available when I invoke it. It's not like call constantly on, and therefore telling me something, right? So it respects my space. And finally, of course, the last one is being transparent. It's able to justify why it did something. The notion of reasoning, right? It's not a pure black box. If these kinds of features in AI tool are probably more pro-immersive, whereas if you look at it on the right side, these may be considered a bit of an anti-immersive, constantly suggesting to you, interrupting your soaking with pop-ups or notifications and stuff like that. It replaces your thinking. It immediately gives you one-liner, two-liner, one-paragraph summaries, promising you something magic. Or it gives you stuff which is, notifications quite a bit. It's demanding, forcing you to move away and destroying your attention. And then finally, of course, is not able to tell you why I did this, but it tells you, in a way, trust my score. The coverage is wonderful. So its coverage is 89% and you don't know how it got that number. Or the quality index is 53%. You don't know how you got that number. So stuff like those which are not, you have a score but you don't know why it is, be careful. Because those kinds of possible tools, they are not necessarily assisting you in the entire process of immersion. So to summarize, if you were to look at it from an AI, apply some kind of a simple design litmus test. Ask an AI feature, does it help me go think deeper? Or does it help me avoid thinking? If it is the latter, then probably deem it anti-immersive. So there are certain features which assist me in my thinking, which is what we think is AI. And there are certain features in the product which are not thinking oriented. They help me do the job, right? Deploy the system or configure the stuff or create certain data sets. They may not necessarily relate to thinking. They might just help me and enable by doing. Now those kinds of stuff, I don't want to be slow. I want to be fast. I don't want to know how you did it. I trust that you probably do a decent job. So I'm not talking about the enablers of doing stuff. I'm really talking about the enablers of helping me think. And that's why the design litmus is on those kinds of features, right? And therefore the core principle, I think at the end of the day, when we harness the AI in this human context of immersion, is AI is most powerful when wielded by someone who has soaked first. And if the AI assistant or tool or whatever you may call helps me in this process of soaking, then it's brilliant, right? Because soaking extends the quality of question. It extends, and therefore AI extends the reach of what I could come up with, the questions and the quality of the questions, right? So going back, remember the system 1 and system 2. If my system 2 thinking slow of Daniel Kahneman, which is about soaking, helps me go deeper, and if any tools help me there, fantastic. And later when I do the fast thinking or fast doing, so to speak, which is sensing, and that's where my other AI pieces can come in, which is more of helping me enable it to sense, seek, do. And that's really how AIs can work. And whatever that we are doing as part of our AI assistant at this point in time is to a large degree driven by this principle, that we think it's more assistive in nature and not a doing in nature. There are a lot of interesting doing tools. So this is something that we are attempting to follow as deeply as we can. Right? And AI is therefore most powerful when wielded by someone who has soaked. So in conclusion, remember, the sharpest probes, the intelligent probes which are sharp, begin with presence. And it's not pure logic. It's not mere tools, be it AI or otherwise. It is about meaningful soaking, rapid sensing, and a combination of these two is what allows us to unfold the intelligence. And of course, in the world that we are obsessed with speed. Nothing wrong with that. But what is still important to understand is the quietest work probably remains the wisest. So in the age of AI, instant answers, relentless speed, the interesting paradox is the slowest work is the smartest. When I say slow, it doesn't mean you go tell somebody, I'm going to do the slowest work. It just means intellectually learn to chew, to ruminate well, to be able to digest and assimilate, and in the process come up with it. So soak first, sense after, amplify with AI. And that's what our method, the latter part of the method of HiBIST is focused on. One part is the logic part, the hypothesis based. The second part of the method is about the right brain part, the ability to soak and sense, and that we call this immersive session. So the tagline therefore there is probe smarter by seeing deeper and therefore assuring better. So thank you very much.